Hi, ethics students. Dr. Bowen here. Thanks for joining me. This is going to be a very short overview of utilitarianism. So we've moved from the part of the course where we talked about moral pluralism and why that fails because it ultimately results in geography or your ethics being determined by where you're standing. So that's obviously not a very good principled approach to moral decision making. Moving forward, now we're talking about consequentialism or teleology, which is where utilitarianism falls. The consequentialist school of ethics, simply stated, says that the outcomes of decisions or the consequences determine whether the decision is right or wrong. The amount of good created should outweigh the amount of bad created, and in so doing, it is a right or morally correct decision. That's a very simple overview. Looking at the history of utilitarianism, it was invented or founded by Jeremy Bentham, a Scottish philosopher, who conceived of it as hedonistic utilitarianism, seeking to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. So pretty limited in that approach, but his student, John Stuart Mill, decided to work on it further and refine what was in utilitarianism. They explored the idea of Eudaimonistic Utilitarianism, which means maximizing happiness and minimizing unhappiness. Or his ultimate conception of utilitarianism was the greater good for the greatest number of people while minimizing harms is the ethical choice. So creating the greater good for a large number of people, always having a positive consequence for the largest number of people, was Mill's idea of the utilitarian calculus. The utilitarian calculus is trying to figure out specifically the consequences of a potential decision so that you can weigh good outcomes and bad outcomes. This is called the Maximin's principle because the Maximin's principle is a simple way of saying you want to maximize the good and minimize the harms or the bad. So we have two main forms of utilitarianism. The first is act utilitarianism that looks specifically at one instance in all of its uniqueness and all of the potential consequences that one specific situation has and determines what is ethical based on seeking the greatest good for the greatest number specifically in that case. Our legal system offers good examples of that type of approach. The second is rule utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism seeks to apply the Maximin's principle to a rule or a class of actions like lying or breaking a promise. You can see from past actions that breaking a promise has had very negative consequences and created more bad outcomes than it has good outcomes. Therefore, you can say in the future you should not break a promise because your outcomes would be anticipated negative. More negative than good outcomes come from that, so it would be a morally unworthy action or unethical. So rule utilitarianism looks at the past a little bit more than act utilitarianism. It looks for a specific type of action to generalize to a class or a rule of actions. So rule utilitarianism can be seen in our vaccination policy in the United States. They know very well that some people will have adverse reactions to a vaccine, but that for most people to be vaccinated is safer for the majority. So the greatest good for the greatest number in preventing smallpox, measles, polio, and other vaccinations that have been legislated so that we have a certain level of safety for the majority, even if there are bad outcomes for a few in the minority who have an allergic reaction or similar. So thinking about utilitarianism, we can see that it has a few advantages. It's very fast. It's an easy form of decision making to engage in. It's somewhat innate for human beings to weigh a cost-benefit analysis in our decision making. But we have some big problems with utilitarianism that make its usefulness a little bit limited, and we have to implement it cautiously. Those problems are that the majority always wins in utilitarianism. So this type of ethical decision making reinforces the status quo, and it may disenfranchise the rights or needs of a minority. What happens if members of that minority have a really good point or a good argument? The majority still wins in this approach to ethics. You have to be able to predict the future in utilitarianism. You have to accurately predict future outcomes, and we know from various crisis situations that those outcomes are not always predictable. We can't predict how certain groups are going to react to things. We can't predict with certainty how the groups will interact with one another as well. So that proves very difficult. In this type of philosophy, the ethical is determined by numbers. So we're not talking about moral principle or why it's right or wrong to do something. We're talking about how many people fall onto a certain side of an issue. And this is one that ethicists have a real problem with, because when you're talking about ethics and you're just talking about numbers and consequences, the morality of the situation often gets lost in the mix. And further problematic, what if you have 50 people on one side of an issue and 50 people on the other side of the issue? Then how do you decide? And then if one person changes their mind, then the whole issue has changed. And if they change it back, the whole issue has reversed again. So we're not dealing really with ethics. We're equating people to numbers. And we know that people are more than numbers. You can't really equate them to numbers. So with these caveats in mind, we can use utilitarianism because it is a quick form of ethical decision making. It does allow us to thoroughly investigate the consequences, to know how our stakeholders and publics may react or be impacted by a decision, and it allows us to have an eye on helping the most people. But those are the types of situations that should be used for utilitarian decision making when you're trying to determine a philanthropy cause, or how to steward your corporate social responsibility in helping the greatest number of people. This form of decision making is not powerful enough to really handle complex moral dilemmas with conflicting decisions and dueling loyalties. We'll be getting to that form of ethical decision making called deontology that's considered a higher level reasoning next. So we'll be talking about deontology and virtue ethics in the future. Thank you for joining me on this quick review of utilitarianism. I appreciate your time.